Silver stood in the darkest corner of the private dining room, her hands folded neatly behind her back. To the three men sitting at the heavy oak table, she was no more important than the expensive wallpaper or the dim, golden lights overhead. She was Silver Ugwumba, a waitress whose only job was to make sure their wine glasses never stayed empty for long. She kept her eyes down and her breathing shallow, playing the part of the silent shadow she had perfected over the last year. Across the table sat Park Jun-suk. He was a man who commanded the room without saying a single word. Even in his crisp, white dress shirt, the dark ink of his tattoos peeked out from under his collar, tracing patterns up his neck like shadows of a violent past. He sat with a terrifying kind of stillness. He didn't fidget. He didn't smile. He simply watched the two businessmen across from him with the patient gaze of a lion waiting for a reason to strike. To Silver, his power felt raw and real, the kind of power that didn't need to brag. The two businessmen, however, were a different story. They wore suits that cost more than Silver made in a year, and their smiles were as bright and fake as the diamonds on their watches. They were leaning forward, laughing and nodding as they pushed a thick stack of legal papers toward Jun-suk. They looked like men who were about to close the deal of a lifetime, treating Jun-suk with a level of respect that felt just a little too perfect. But Silver could hear what they were really thinking. As she stepped forward to refill a glass of deep red wine, the taller businessman glanced at her for a split second. His eyes dismissed her instantly. To him, she was just a black girl in a uniform who couldn't possibly understand the complex, rapid-fire Korean dialect he and his partner were using. He turned back to his friend and let out a small, sharp chuckle. "Look at him," the man whispered in a thick, localized accent that most outsiders would never recognize. "He sits there like a king, but he's just a dog in a suit. He has no idea he's signing away his life." His partner smirked, tapping his fountain pen against the contract. "Let him feel powerful for 5 more minutes. Once his name is on this page, he won't have a kingdom left to rule. We'll lead him straight to the slaughterhouse while he thanks us for the privilege." Silver felt a cold shiver run down her spine, but she didn't let her hand shake. She poured the wine with steady precision, the dark liquid swirling in the glass like a warning. She knew that dialect. She knew those specific, cruel words they used for a sacrificial lamb. In her old life as an intelligence analyst, she had been trained to hear the truth hidden behind the noise. Now, that training was screaming at her. She looked at Jun-suk. He reached for the pen, his tattooed fingers hovering just inches away from the paper. He was a dangerous man, yes. But he was a man being walked into a trap by people who thought they were smarter than everyone else in the room. The air in the room felt heavy, like the moments right before a massive storm breaks. Silver knew that if she stayed silent, she would be safe. She would remain invisible. But if she spoke, she would be stepping back into the light, a place where the people who ruined her life could find her again. She caught her reflection in the polished surface of the wine bottle. She saw a woman who was tired of hiding. She saw the invisible ear who had heard one secret too many. As the businessmen shared another mocking look, Silver took a small, quiet step closer to the Mafia boss. The choice was right there in front of her, as sharp and clear as the clink of porcelain in the silent room. The air in the private room felt thicker now, heavy with the smell of expensive steak and the even heavier weight of a lie. Silver moved like a ghost, her soft footsteps lost in the deep carpet as she reached for the empty appetizer plates. Across the table, the two businessmen were leaning back, their faces glowing with a false kind of warmth. They looked like old friends sharing a meal, but Silver could see the hunger in their eyes. It wasn't a hunger for food. It was a hunger for the power Park Jun-suk held in his scarred, tattooed hands. The shorter man, whose suit was so sharp it looked like it could cut glass, took a slow sip of his wine. He looked at Jun-suk and spoke in perfect, formal English. "This partnership will change everything, Mr. Park. Our resources combined with your strength will make us unstoppable." Jun-suk nodded once, a short and simple movement. He didn't say much, which only seemed to make the businessmen more confident. They thought his silence was a sign of a slow mind. They thought he was a blunt tool they could use and then throw away. As Silver leaned in to clear a stray fork, the businessmen switched back to their native tongue. They spoke in a very specific, jagged dialect from the southern coast of Korea. It was a secret language, full of slang that a standard translator would never find in a textbook. But Silver wasn't a standard translator. Her ears, trained by years of high-level intelligence work, caught every jagged edge of their words. "The gogi myogi is almost ready," the taller one whispered, his voice smooth and oily. Silver froze for a heartbeat, though she kept her face as blank as a stone wall. Gogi myogi. In that specific dialect, it didn't just mean meat-eater. It was a cruel term for a beast of burden, an animal you fatten up just so it can carry your heavy loads before you eventually kill it for the meat. They weren't just insulting him, they were labeling him. To them, the powerful mafia boss sitting at the head of the table was nothing more than a cow being led to a butcher. "Look at the way he holds the pen," the shorter man added, a mean glint in his eyes as he spoke in the dialect. "He thinks he is signing a merger. He doesn't realize he is signing the red clause. By the time the sun rises tomorrow, his warehouses will be ours, his men will be ours, and he will be a ghost." The red clause. Silver knew exactly what that meant in the world of hostile takeovers. It was a hidden piece of legal text, usually buried in the fine print, that allowed one side to seize everything if a single, tiny condition wasn't met. These men weren't here to build a business. They were here to commit a robbery in broad daylight, using nothing but paper and ink. The businessmen laughed together, a sound that seemed bright and cheerful to anyone else in the room. To Silver, it sounded like the clicking of a gun being loaded. She looked at the contract sitting on the table. It looked innocent enough, but she knew it was a death warrant. If Jun-suk pushed that pen across the paper, the city would burn. A gang war would break out as he fought to win back what was stolen, and hundreds of people would pay the price for these two men's greed. She felt a bead of sweat start to form at the back of her neck. Her old life, the one she had tried so hard to bury, was pulling at her. She had spent a year trying to be a nobody, a waitress who saw nothing and heard nothing. But the dialect of deceit was ringing in her ears. She knew the truth, and in this room, the truth was the only weapon that could stop the slaughter. She looked at Jun-suk's hand. His fingers tightened around the pen. He began to lower it toward the signature line. The businessmen leaned in closer, their breath held in excitement, their fake smiles stretching even wider. They were seconds away from winning. Silver realized she couldn't just stand there and watch a man be destroyed by a language he didn't understand. Silver's hand hovered near the wine bottle, but her mind was suddenly miles away and years in the past. The cold air of the restaurant's air conditioning felt like the sterile, freezing wind of the government office where she used to spend her days. Before she was a waitress in a starched apron, she was a woman who lived behind 3 locked doors and a dozen computer passwords. She had been the golden ear of the intelligence agency, a prodigy who could pull the truth out of a static-filled phone call or a coded email. She remembered the day everything changed. It hadn't been a big, cinematic moment with guns or high-speed chases. It had been a simple spreadsheet. She had found a hidden clause back then. 2. A secret payment from a government contractor that was being used to fund a private war in a country most people couldn't find on a map. She had been young and full of a bright, burning belief in justice. She thought that if she showed the truth to the right people, the world would fix itself. Instead, the world tried to erase her. The people she thought were her allies turned out to be the ones holding the pens. Within 48 hours of filing her report, her security clearance was revoked. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her professional history was deleted as if she had never existed. She became a dead woman walking, a whistleblower who had been silenced by the very system she tried to protect. They didn't kill her, but they took away her life, leaving her with nothing but her name and the terrifying knowledge that she was being watched. That was why she had chosen the service industry. In a high-end restaurant, you are expected to be a ghost. You move through the background of other people's lives, blending into the shadows of the pillars and the folds of the heavy curtains. Being a waitress was her safety. If she was just the girl who brought the steak and refilled the water, nobody would look at her twice. No one would suspect that the woman clearing their plates could speak 6 languages or explain the inner workings of a shell company. But standing here now, watching these businessmen pull the same trick on Jun-suk, Silver felt a familiar, bitter taste in her mouth. She had run away to the shadows to avoid the red clauses and the secret insults of the world. Yet here they were again, sitting right at her table. She had spent a year convincing herself that staying silent was the only way to stay alive. She told herself that it wasn't her job to save anyone anymore. If the world was full of sharks and snakes, she would just stay out of the water. She looked at Jun-suk's face again. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who lived by his own violent set of rules. But he was honest in his own way. He didn't hide behind fake smiles or fancy legal words. He was exactly what he appeared to be. The businessmen, on the other hand, were the ghosts of her past. They were the suits and the smiles that destroyed lives from behind a desk. Silver's fingers brushed the edge of her apron. She could feel the weight of her choice. To stay a waitress was to stay safe, but it was also to stay a victim. To speak up was to bring the ghost of the whistleblower back to life. She looked at the pen in Jun-suk's hand, hovering over the paper. The silence in the room felt like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. She realized that she had been hiding for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to have a voice. The silence in the Polaris suite was so heavy it felt like it might shatter. Silver watched the fountain pen in Park Jun-suk's hand. The nib was a fraction of an inch from the paper, a tiny point of black ink ready to sign away an empire. The two businessmen were practically vibrating with excitement. Their fake smiles stretched so tight they looked like masks. They thought they had won. They thought the beast of burden was finally walking into the trap. Silver's heart hammered against her ribs like a bird in a cage. She knew the waitress code by heart. Stay silent, stay invisible, and never, ever interfere with the guests. If she spoke now, she wasn't just breaking a rule. She was blowing her cover and stepping back into a world of danger. But as she looked at the mocking glint in the businessmen's eyes, she realized she couldn't let another red claws destroy a man's life while she stood by and watched. She took a slow, deliberate breath. She reached for the heavy crystal wine bottle on the sideboard, her fingers steady despite the fire in her chest. She stepped forward, moving into the light of the overhead chandelier. The businessmen didn't even look at her. To them, she was just a tool for pouring liquid. Silver leaned in. She didn't stop at a polite distance. She leaned deep into Jun-suk's personal space, the scent of his expensive cologne and old leather filling her senses. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw his bodyguard's hand twitch toward his jacket, but Jun-suk didn't move. He remained perfectly still, his dark eyes tracking her every movement. Under the guise of refilling his glass, Silver tilted her head just enough so her lips were inches from his ear. The businessmen were busy whispering to each other in their secret dialect, laughing quietly at their own cleverness. They didn't notice the shift in the room's energy. "Don't sign the red clause, Mr. Park," Silver whispered. Her voice was low, melodic, and perfectly clear. "The Gogi Myogi is a trap. They aren't building a bridge, they are building a butcher's block." Jun-suk's hand froze. The pen stayed hovered over the line, but he didn't pull away. He didn't even blink. He just sat there, his tattooed neck muscles tightening as he absorbed the shock of a waitress speaking to him in his own language, and using the very slang his enemies thought was a secret. Silver didn't wait for a reaction. She finished pouring the wine with a graceful flick of her wrist, wiped the rim of the bottle with her white linen cloth, and stepped back into the shadows. She went back to her spot against the wall, her hands once again folded behind her back. Her face was a mask of professional calm, but inside, she felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. The tall businessman noticed the pause. His smile faltered, just for a second. "Is there a problem, Mr. Park? The ink is dry. All we need is your mark to begin our great future together." Jun-suk didn't answer him. Instead, he slowly turned his head. For the first time that night, he didn't look at the contract. He didn't look at his business partners. He looked straight back at Silver, his eyes burning with a sudden, dangerous curiosity. He looked at her not as a waitress, but as a person who had just handed him a loaded gun. The air in the room didn't just feel thick anymore. It felt electric. The invisible ear had spoken, and the world was never going to be the same. The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the quiet of a high-end restaurant. It was the heavy, breathless silence that comes right before a lightning strike. Park Jun-suk didn't move for a long time. He just sat there, his eyes locked onto Silver's face, searching for a sign of a lie. When he found none, he slowly turned his gaze back to the two businessmen. The tall man cleared his throat, his smile starting to look a bit shaky. "Mr. Park, is everything all right? The wine, perhaps it was not to your liking?" Jun-suk didn't answer. Instead, he did something that made the air in the room feel ice cold. He picked up the heavy crystal wine glass Silver had just filled and held it up to the light. The deep red liquid caught the glow of the chandelier, looking almost like blood. Then, with a sudden violent snap of his wrist, he slammed the glass down onto the center of the mahogany table. The glass didn't just break. It shivered into 1,000 tiny diamonds that skittered across the contract. Red wine splashed over the white paper, soaking into the signature line like a fresh wound. The businessmen jumped in their seats, their faces turning the color of chalk. "The Gogi Myogi," Junsuk said. His voice was a low, terrifying growl that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. He spoke the slang perfectly, throwing their own secret insult back into their faces. The shorter businessman gasped, his hands trembling as he reached for the ruined contract. "Mr. Park, I don't know what you mean. That is a vulgar term. We would never." "Silence," Junsuk commanded. He didn't shout, but the word hit the room like a physical blow. He stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the table. He pointed a tattooed finger at a specific paragraph in the middle of the 3rd page, the one Silver had identified as the red clause. "Explain this," Junsuk whispered. "Explain why my warehouses are listed as collateral for a loan I never asked for. Explain why you think I am a beast of burden meant for your slaughterhouse." The businessmen looked at each other in total panic. They weren't the smooth, powerful players they had been 5 minutes ago. They were trapped animals. The taller one looked toward the door, but Junsuk's bodyguards had already stepped into the light, their faces as hard as granite. There was nowhere to run. We can explain," the shorter man stuttered, his voice rising in fear. "It was a mistake. A translation error. The lawyers must have." Junsuk leaned over the table, his hands pressing into the wood. "There was no translation error. There was only the belief that I was too stupid to hear what was being said in the dark." He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Silver again. She stood perfectly still in the shadows, her heart racing, but her gaze steady. For the first time, Junsuk looked at her with something that resembled respect. He turned back to the businessman, his face turning into a mask of cold fury. "You didn't just try to steal my empire. You insulted my intelligence in my own house." He picked up the fountain pen, the one he was supposed to use to sign his own downfall, and snapped it in half between 2 fingers. Black ink leaked out, mixing with the red wine on the table. "The meal is over," Junsuk said. "Now, we are going to talk about who really sent you. And you are going to tell me everything, or you will find out exactly how a beast of burden treats its enemies." The room felt like it was shrinking. The glass shivers had signaled the end of the lie. The businessmen were no longer in control, and Silver, the waitress they had ignored, was the one who had handed the king his sword. The 2 businessmen looked like they were drowning in open air. The tall one's expensive silk tie was suddenly too tight, and his partner's face had turned a sickly shade of gray. They looked back and forth between Park Junsuk's cold, dark eyes and the ruined, wine-soaked contract on the table. They were searching for a way out, a lie that could fix the mess they had made. "Mr. Park," the taller man started, his voice cracking like dry wood. We don't understand. Who told you about a red clause? Who told you about the meat?" Junsuk didn't answer right away. He just stood there, tall and steady, like a mountain that was about to fall on them. He slowly turned his head toward the shadows where Silver stood. He didn't point, and he didn't say her name, but the weight of his gaze was like a spotlight. The businessmen followed his eyes. They looked at Silver, really looked at her, for the first time all night. Their expressions shifted from confusion to a sharp, stinging realization. They saw the help. They saw the black waitress who had been refilling their water and clearing their crumbs while they laughed at their own secret jokes. "Her?" The shorter man gasped. He pointed a shaking finger at Silver. "You listened to her? She's just a server. She couldn't possibly know what we were saying. That dialect is from the coast. It's impossible." He turned back to his partner, looking for support, but the taller man was staring at Silver with a new kind of horror. He remembered the way she had leaned in. He remembered the calm, steady way she had held the wine bottle. He realized that the bridge they thought they were crossing was never there. They had been walking on a tightrope, and the woman they had ignored had just cut the string. "She understood every word," Junsuk said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "She understood the insults. She understood the meat-eater jokes. And she understood the trap you hid in the fine print." The businessmen's arrogance vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow fear. The unmasked bridge had collapsed. They had spent the whole night feeling superior, thinking they were the smartest people in the room because they spoke a language no one else knew. Now, they realized that their secret wasn't a secret at all. They had been performing their betrayal in front of a professional witness. "How?" the tall man whispered. his eyes wide as he stared at Silver. "How do you know our tongue?" Silver didn't blink. She didn't drop her gaze. For a year, she had been a ghost. But now she felt the old power of her intelligence days rushing back through her veins. She didn't need to explain her past. She didn't need to tell them about the government offices or the years of training. The look in her eyes was enough to tell them that she was far more dangerous than any waitress they had ever met. "The problem with looking down on people," Silver said, her voice steady and cool, "is that you never notice when they are listening." The shorter businessman slumped back into his chair, his hands falling limp at his sides. The game was over. They had been unmasked by the person they thought was the least important person in the building. As Jun-suk's guards stepped closer, the businessmen finally understood the truth. They hadn't been the hunters tonight. They had been the prey all along. The room moved into a different kind of order. Park Jun-suk did not have to raise his voice or wave his arms. He simply tilted his head, and his men moved like shadows. They stepped forward and gripped the two businessmen by their expensive suit jackets, lifting them from their chairs as if they weighed nothing at all. The men who had been laughing and insulting their host just minutes ago were now begging, their voices high and thin as they were marched toward the heavy soundproof doors of the Polaris suite. "Wait, Mr. Park, please," the taller one cried out, his face wet with sweat. "It was just business. We can fix the contract." Jun-suk didn't even look at them. He stood by the table, his hands resting on the back of his chair, watching the red wine drip off the edge of the mahogany and onto the carpet. When the doors clicked shut, leaving the room in a sudden, ringing silence, he finally turned his attention to Silver. She was still standing in her corner, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked like a perfect waitress again. But the secret was out. The air between them had changed. Jun-suk walked toward her, his heavy footsteps muffled by the rug. He stopped a few feet away, tall and imposing, the tattoos on his neck dark against his white shirt. He looked at her not as a servant, but as a puzzle he needed to solve. "A king usually knows who is sitting at his table," Jun-suk said, his voice low and steady. "But it seems I didn't even know who was standing behind it. You saved my life tonight. You saved my city from a war that would have burned every block." Silver kept her chin up. She didn't look away from his piercing gaze. "I only told you what was being said, Mr. Park. The truth was already in the room. I just gave it a voice." Jun-suk let out a short, dark laugh. "Don't lie to me. Not after you just stopped a lie that big. You didn't just give it a voice. You heard a dialect that even my own best translators struggle with. You saw a legal trap that most lawyers would miss after a week of reading. You aren't a waitress. And you aren't just a girl who happened to learn a second language." He stepped closer, his presence filling the space around her. It was a debt of a king, a weight of gratitude from a man who usually didn't owe anyone anything. "I want the truth," he commanded, though his tone was more curious than angry. "No more masks. No more silent shadows. Who are you, and why is a woman with your mind carrying plates in a place like this?" Silver felt the last of her waitress mask crumble. She looked at the man who held so much power, and then she looked at her own hands. Hands that were meant for keyboards and files, not bread baskets and wine bottles. She realized that the safety of being invisible was gone. She couldn't hide in the shadows anymore because the king had seen her light. "My name is Silver Agwumba," she began, her voice gaining the strength of her old self. "And before I was a ghost in this restaurant, I was the person who kept people like those businessmen from ever reaching the table." Jun-suk pulled out a chair, not for himself but for her. It was a silent invitation to sit where the powerful sat. He watched her with a new kind of intensity, waiting for the story of the woman who had lived 1,000 lives before she ever picked up a tray. Silver did not sit down immediately. She looked at the expensive chair as if it were a trap, then she looked back at Jun-suk. The weight of her secret felt like a heavy stone she had been carrying for too long. If she spoke now, the price of visibility would be high. She would no longer be a ghost, she would be a target again. "I was a ghost by choice, Mr. Park," Silver said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "Before I wore this uniform, I worked for people who have names you only see in the news. I was an intelligence analyst. My job was to listen to the whispers of the world and find the lies hidden in the noise." She took a slow breath, remembering the cold offices and the blue glow of computer screens. "I found a lie that was too big to ignore. A contractor was stealing millions and starting wars for profit. I did what I was trained to do. I blew the whistle. I thought the truth would protect me. I was wrong. Jun-suk leaned against the table, his tattooed arms crossed. He didn't interrupt. He watched her with a serious, focused look that told her he understood exactly what it meant to be betrayed by the people you trusted. They didn't put me in jail, Silver continued, her voice trembling just a little. They did something worse. They erased me. They took my money, my history, and my reputation. To the government, I am a dead woman walking. I came to this restaurant because no one looks at the face of the person serving their dinner. I thought that if I stayed invisible, I would be safe. But tonight, I chose to be seen. And once you are seen, you can never go back to the shadows. The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't cold or scary, it was thoughtful. Jun-suk looked at the red wine stain on the table, then back at Silver. He knew what it was like to be hunted. He knew what it was like to have enemies who used pens and paper instead of guns. You are a dead woman to the government, Jun-suk said, his voice deep and calm. But in this room, you are the woman who saved a king. Those men who tried to steal my empire have friends in high places. Now that you have stopped them, they will come looking for the person who whispered in my ear. You are right, you cannot go back to being a waitress. He stepped closer, standing right in front of her. He didn't look like a scary mafia boss in that moment. He looked like a shield. The people who erased you think they are the only ones with power. They are wrong. My world has different rules. In my world, loyalty is the only thing that matters. You protected me, Silver Agwamba. Now, it is my turn to protect you. Silver looked into his eyes and saw a promise. It was a dangerous promise, but for the first time in a year, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like a person again. She had paid the price of being seen, but she had gained an ally that the government could never erase. I don't just want to protect you, Jun-suk added, a small, dark smile touching his lips. I want to use that brilliant mind of yours. A man in my position needs a pair of eyes that can see through any lie. Stay with me, and you won't have to hide anymore. You will be the architect of something new. Silver looked at her starched white apron, and then at the powerful man offering her a new life. She realized the price of visibility was steep, but the reward was finally having a voice again. The starched white apron was gone. The sensible, flat shoes Silver had worn for a year were replaced by heels that clicked with a sharp, steady rhythm against the polished marble floors. She no longer stood in the corners or waited for a signal to move. Today, she walked through the center of the room, and for the first time, every eye followed her. The private office at the top of Park Jun-suk's tower was different from the restaurant. There were no clinking wine glasses or smells of expensive steak. Instead, there was only the quiet hum of high-end computers and the sight of the city spreading out below like a map. Jun-suk was sitting at a massive desk made of dark wood. But he wasn't alone. He was waiting for her. The reports from the morning meetings, Silver said, her voice calm and filled with a new kind of authority. She laid a folder on the desk. It wasn't a menu. It was a breakdown of 3 different companies trying to partner with Jun-suk's empire. 2 of them are honest. The third one is using a shell company in Singapore to hide their debts. They think they can use your reputation to wash their dirty money. Jun-suk leaned back in his chair. A small, proud smile touching his lips. He didn't even open the folder. He didn't need to. In the weeks since the dinner at the Goryeo room, he had learned that Silver Agwamba never missed a detail. She was his new architect, the person who designed his safety and his success from behind the scenes. They still think they are talking to a businessman, Jun-suk said, his eyes reflecting the blue light of the monitors. They don't realize they are being watched by the best intelligence mind in the country. Silver sat down in the chair across from him. A few weeks ago, she had been afraid to even touch the furniture. Now she belonged there. She was no longer a dead woman walking. She was a woman who had been reborn in the heart of a new kind of power. She had traded the safety of being invisible for the thrill of being essential. I caught a whisper on a private server this morning, Silver added, her eyes sharp. The people who erased me. They are starting to wonder why their old enemies are losing so much ground. They don't know it's me yet, but they know someone is outthinking them. Jun-suk leaned forward, his tattooed hands resting on the desk. Let them wonder. Let them try to find the ghost they created. By the time they realize you are here, we will have built a wall they can never climb. You aren't just a whistleblower anymore, Silver. You are the one who holds the keys to the city. Silver looked out the window at the skyline. She remembered the girl in the starched apron who was afraid of her own shadow. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who knew that knowledge was the only real currency, and she had more of it than anyone else. She wasn't just a waitress who knew a secret. She was the architect of a future where no one would ever be able to silence her again. As she reached for her tablet to start the next project, Silver felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had paid the price of visibility, and the view from the top was worth every penny.